Okay, so welcome everyone to this final Friday forum of 2021. I'm very pleased to say that Richard is chairing this one. So over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm delighted to welcome Andra Patterson and indeed Nick Jones to present today. Many of you will know Andra. I understand that she's a New Zealander and a composer, a member of the LSO chorus, a music librarian at the British Library. And I don't know which of your many roles, Andra, this comes under. I know you're a metadata manager based at the British Library as well, and also you've been cataloguing many of the Max archive that have been coming in thick and fast, it seems, over the last couple of years. I think, sparing your modesty, we should say that as a composer, she often has a good connection with Orkney and the Orkney Camerata. And she, according to her little biography, she went back in June 2017 where her chamber piece Magnus Hymn was the winning entry in the St Magnus Composers Competition and performed by the Assembly Project. So without any further ado, Andra, I just pass over to you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Just to let you know, I now have changed jobs at the British Library. So I was formerly a metadata manager with way too many people to manage, and now I am the music manuscripts and archives cataloguer, which is much more in alignment with my passions. I'll just share screen. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So I've called this presentation today Bearing Witness. Those of you who, well, probably all of you know that Max often spoke of, this is not moving forward. Sorry. Oh, it's just being slow, I think. Mentioned bearing witness, or the need to bear witness, in his music. And as I've been working on his archive, or his most recent additions to his archive, it sort of spoke to me that, you know, his need to bear witness in his music is reflected also in his archive. There's such a richness of material that his archive certainly bears witness to his life in a warts and all way. Which is rather wonderful. So just to give you an overview of how to access Peter MaxwellDaveys material at the BL, I've pinched this from a presentation that Chris Scobie gave you a while back. So it's just to give you an idea of how to get to things in the collection. And the bit in purple at the bottom, MS Mus 1825, is sort of part 3 of Max's archive, and that's the part that I'm working on at the moment, and it's what I'll talk about mostly today. And I'll be focusing on the papers that have been received rather than the scores. So when you're an archivist or a cataloguer and you're faced with a huge mountain of material to work on, how do you start? It's, you know, it's something massive. And you want to do justice to the person whose archive it is. So first, there are some questions that you ask yourself. You need to get a sense for the type of material that's present. You need to determine if there's a discernible order amongst the material that you might need to maintain, because this particular deposit came in several batches from different places. You have to kind of weigh up the principles of archival arrangement, which say to keep things from one person or organization together versus a pragmatic approach of how we can present that material to researchers. So there's a kind of balance there. we have to get an idea of the physical condition of the collection. Is it safe for me to handle it? Does it need to be quarantined? Are there any signs of infestation or mold? And is there any immediate conservation work required? So it takes quite a long time to do a kind of first sweep through the collection. And just to give you an idea, the scores in this collection are in good condition. Professional papers, I'll sort of go into what they are shortly, are in a good condition. So are the legal papers. The correspondence is a real mixed bag. Some of it is okay. Some needs repair. There's a lot of mold and dirt. There's some water damage, some mouse droppings and insect damage. And the journals, some are okay and some have some dirt. And then there's visual material as well in the collection. And some of that is a bit moldy, but it's generally not too bad. So at the moment, the collection has been divided temporarily. Chris Scobie, who's the curator of music manuscripts, in case you don't know, who's on this call today, worked with the conservation department staff to divide this latest tranche of material into that requiring immediate treatment and material that's okay for now. It's a large collection, so the work has not yet started on treatment to remove mold, but it is next in line for that. We're just waiting for another very large collection to be finished first, and that's the archive of Tony Benn. Also on that first sweep through, it's a good idea to have an eye out for sensitive material. So in the case of Max's latest archive, the legal papers are sensitive. Most of the correspondence is okay, but some is sensitive. There's quite a bit in German and Italian, so there's a need to kind of get a basic translation in order to determine if any of it's sensitive. Most of the journals contain sensitive material. The visual material, most is okay. I've put some sensitive because there's a rather amazing design for a bedroom mural, which is somewhat erotic. So looking first at the letters, which is what I've been mostly working with recently, there are plenty of challenges, as you will know from your own research. So there's challenges in identifying correspondence, identifying dates, piecing together letters that have become separated, and the conservation issues already talked about. So this letter I'm showing here is by Tony Benn, came from Tony Benn. It has no date. So we don't know exactly what Max might have written to Tony, but I quite like, there are more of us than the establishment admits. It's quite a nice little note. So here are some examples of some letters that are in quite poor condition. Again, this one is undated. Oh, no, it's not. It's got 8th of August on the actual letter, but luckily we have an envelope that tells us the year on the postmark, so that's good. So this is from John Ogden to Max, and there's a lot of discussion about how he's playing some phrases of music and asking him what Max meant when there must have been a letter from Max to John talking about the Beethoven 9 excerpt, an excerpt from Beethoven 9, and John's puzzled about it and questions Max. It's reasonably hard to read all of it, and there are some bits missing on the corners. There's the last 2 pages of that. So a bit of a challenge to look at. And then there's this one, which is even worse. So similar sort of letter. You can make out most of it. It's got some very serious folds that are kind of mold encrusted. So that presents some challenges. They're not all like this. I just wanted to give you an idea of what we're dealing with. I mentioned the need to translate letters in German, of which there are a lot to and from the class and family. So when I say to and from, sometimes Max drafted his letters in other languages. I'll show you an example of that at the moment. So here's a letter from Eberhard Fork, typewritten, which is easy to read, dated, which is great, but with water damage and mold, and a need to translate. So I mentioned the class and family in Germany. There's also quite a lot of Italian letters. And so here are some examples of Max's draft letters. On the left, there's one in Italian, and in fact there are two in Italian. There's to two different people on that same page. And then he also did really interesting drafts, and these are really valuable, I think, of letters on difficult topics. So this isn't a very startling example of that. This one's it's a letter to the newspaper, I think, about aircraft noise. And he's obviously been thinking about how best to word it. But there are others that are a little more of a sensitive nature that I haven't put in this presentation, that cover sort of misunderstandings between friends. Some really large amount of letters from his mother, as you might expect. They're usually undated. They might sometimes have a day of the week. There's usually no envelope, so there's no postmark date. They're on quite an interesting range of topics, actually. There's a lot about music. Just about every letter, maybe I'm exaggerating slightly, mentions laundry. So this first one says, "So glad about the organ piece. Do air the pajamas, please. Have only just been ironed." So quite sort of domestic, but then also the second one there talks about, have just read The Observer. Hope they didn't throw tomatoes too. It must be a great thrill to hear your music played, Max, however the audience take it. I hope you were satisfied with the performance. It must have had plenty of life in it, from what I can assume. So they're really interesting letters, but more domestic than some. So letters from friends, rather than including the kind of obvious musician friends, such as Harry Birtwistle and Sandy Gurr, I've instead put another example of a more domestic, perhaps, letter. So for a while, it took me a while to figure out who this person is. So there are lots of letters signed from someone called Jean. She doesn't usually date her letters, but sometimes there's an envelope, as there is in this case. And there were just so many of them that I kind of wanted to know who she was. And there's one, in fact, where she expresses her love for Max, which was never requited. So thankfully, Richard helped me out to find her some more biographical information about her. And in fact, her full name was Dorothy Jean Sherritt. And from the address that she put on this letter, I think, Richard, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Richard was able to confirm that she was Jean Sherritt. I hadn't known about her, Dorothy Jean Sherritt. So if you're really immersed in a person's life through working with their archive, it's very easy to do too much research into people. Well, I put how much research should an archivist do, because you want to identify people, you want to identify dates, but it can take a long time. But it's incredibly interesting, and usually if you spend long enough, you can figure it out. At the same time, you want to be getting the collection into a state where it can be used by people who are undertaking, full research on it. So an archivist can't sort of hold a collection back while they're working on it for too long. I quite like also the back of this envelope says sugar, butter, meat, presumably in Max's hand. So another undated letter, this one actually reasonably easy to figure out when it was. It's Ken Russell saying that he would love to come on the glorious 12th. Well, just from the time of Savage Messiah and stuff like this, and a sort of suspicion, I could figure out that this is almost certainly referring to the opening of Taverner on the 12th of July, 1972. So that one didn't take too long. There are also some letters with Max's annotations on, which can be amusing. So this is a letter from the BBC asking for information from Max, or wanting to visit Max and the school in Cirencester to see his work and methods. And you'll see what Max has written in response: not bloody likely. And there are several printed items in the collection which are annotated by Max. Richard, you might want to look at this one, because I'm not sure if it should be classed as sensitive or not. So this is an athletic sports program from Lee Grammar School, and you'll see he's put a little system of a key of markings: I like, I nearly like, and I know. And that's fine, but on the right there we can see something that he's written in code, which would be interesting to know what that is. Richard, if you're able to puzzle it out, that would be very interesting. Of course, the code stuff crops up all the time, but it's particularly important to figure it out for comments that might be sensitive in nature. So just a quick look at what's included in the more professional papers in the collection. So there are things like composing schedules, text agreements, commissioning agreements, copyright assignments, royalty payments, corrections for proofs. There are legal papers and other sensitive materials. So we have a compliance manager, and his team provides advice to us about sensitive material. So to confirm what is considered sensitive and how long we might need to reserve it for if it is considered sensitive. I'm sure you'll have more questions about that. Hopefully Chris can help me with that. Richard mentioned diaries. Journals and notebooks certainly contain some sensitive material. There's one journal that's entirely in code, which Richard may have presented about before, I'm not sure, but he's been looking at that. He certainly mentioned it. And something I was less aware of until more recently was that Max reused a number of his father's work notebooks. So the image on the left is his father's use, and then Max has used this to investigate some things around Palestrina and who else was it? Can't remember. Gabriele, maybe. There are also photos, programs, and posters, as there were in previous tranches. And so it can be quite time-consuming, but we need to check whether the new material that's come in, whether we already have copies of those items in the collection, because we don't have room to store duplicate material. And we have several miscellaneous items. We have a medallion from Caesar's Palace. We have official documents that should probably be returned, such as Max's passport. I think this is his father's wallet, or some various personal items. One of the things I've really enjoyed looking at are the items from Max's childhood. So we've got his baby record, There are various school exercise books with stories and things in that he's written. And there are school reports, and I've included this one from 1945. And down the bottom, there's just a blow up of the bit where music is kind of entered in and pen underneath woodwork, and it says, "A promising beginning, especially in composition," which is rather nice. That's all I had. I think that's probably about 20 minutes, but I'm happy to take any questions or have conversations. I hope that Chris Scobie, you can help me out with the questions as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Andra. Okay, can we, I will stop sharing screen at the moment, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I should perhaps, since you've mentioned the diary, and I've got a picture of the thing that you want translated. I'm having some trouble with the fact that it moves together, but I'll get there. I should say that I actually have now translated the diary, which is in complete code, but I'm the only person at the moment who has the translation, because I've done it over the top of. But I also did one in 2015, which was half all diary. And for the most part, Max's annotations are entirely almost banal at sometimes, made a cup of coffee, that kind of thing. But as you can imagine, there are some bits of it which would be very sensitive, particularly, and the sensitivity would extend to some of the diaries which are actually not in code, but mention people who are still alive. So, I mean, those are the kind of ones which really, I think we agreed with the trustees that those kind of things would be withheld.
Yeah.
And I don't suppose that people want to know about when he made a cup of coffee or something. But there are aspects of his procedure which are explored in there, and particularly some interesting things in all the diaries about his reaction to different composers, usually dead. People like Mahler, whom he taught about, Mahler, and often, and perhaps to a degree Beethoven, but not so much. Other composers, that would be sensitive too, perhaps, sometimes. But at the same time, there's things that can be abstracted from the diaries, which I think help to understand his compositional processes. Are there any questions from anyone? Nick, don't forget to unmute.
Thank you. I nearly forgot that. Andra, thank you so much. I mean, you packed an awful lot in there, and you're doing an absolute wonderful job as far as I can see. And it's going to keep scholars very busy for the foreseeable future once you finish your task. So, I'm really looking forward to looking at some of those things myself. Just before I ask you a question, I've looked quite extensively at the later diaries. I know Richard has concentrated on the early ones and the 1970s, etc. But yeah, there's quite a lot of sensitive material, as you possibly know, in the later ones as well, particularly when he's responding to events that are going on in the everyday news, but also in response to people who have died recently, musicians, composers, conductors. He can be quite brutal sometimes. So yeah, there's quite a lot of information there as well, which is going to be classed sensitive. My question, I was really interested actually in Max's mother's letters. What I could read very, very quickly there, it seems that there's quite a lot of information there concerning music. So I was really interested to see that.
Yeah, she comes across in her letters as a really supportive intelligent provider of ideas, and I'm quite taken with her letters because they're so mixed with music and domesticity.
Yeah.
The two I put up were very brief, but actually a lot of them are considerably longer, and with much more detail about music and ideas and sort of German culture, and really quite deep.
I think that's wonderful to have this kind of this rounded image of his parents. And we know that she was a very, very decent, very accomplished painter as well. And there's a wonderful portrait of Max when he was a teenager that she did, which is now in the Orkney Library, I seem to remember. So yeah, I think that's really good. Are there any letters from his father?
There is one I can remember where I think his mother's away, and so he's written instead. She usually writes and either puts your loving mother or your loving parents. Yes. And there's certainly plenty of mention of his father, but there aren't many written by him, but there are a few.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing that caught my eye was Max's baby records. And
mine too.
Certainly in response in with respect to the fact that he was adopted, as we now know, and also the use of Peter, which by the look of it, he certainly wasn't born with that name and he wasn't christened with that name, and it looks as though that he's used that name himself in the diaries from the late 40s onwards. So I noticed there in his baby record, he's still Maxwell Davies. And this is where Max obviously comes from, our Max. Our Max, he used to say that a lot when he was, talking about his parents and so forth, how they used to refer to him and his family. So, yeah, really interesting document those.
There is one letter in particular, actually. I'll see if I can find it for you, which is, I can't remember which friend it is. I think it's a friend from the grammar school, but writing to Max when he's older about the program for a piece and commenting on, I see they've called you Peter. Do you want to be called Peter?
No, but thank you. That's really, really great. Really great.
It's a privilege to work on it. It really is. It's a great archive. Thank you.
I bet. I envy you.
Any other questions? Ryan.
Oh yeah. So I've got particular interest in Peter MaxwellDaveys' work. I went to Dartington College of Arts, and I'm now reading a PhD in music theatre, two things that he's very well known for. I was wondering sort of if you'd come across any materials relating to the Dartington Summer Schools or his particular sort of creation of music theatre work.
Yes.
Sort of go hand in hand.
Yes and yes. The Dartington, there are quite a few letters from Max to his parents. So as well as the letters coming to Max, there are, and as well as the drafts, I should have mentioned actually that there are also the letters he sent to his parents are also within the collection. So there are comments about Dartington in there. There are lots of letters with reference to creative process, especially around Taverner, or letters and other documents around Taverner, which I was actually going to highlight today, but then the other speaker changed, so I decided not to. So yes, there is lots. There are also, another thing I didn't highlight were the writings. So there are people's writings on Max, sort of copies of PhDs and things, and there are also writings by Max, which of course Nicholas and Richard, you must have seen most of to go into the writings book. Whether there are additional writings by Max that aren't in there, I haven't kind of sat down and looked at yet, but there are lots of writings about his creative process.
Also, and just sorry, Karen.
That's right.
Just follow up question: how do we go about accessing this material? Like, is it ready to be seen yet, or is it still a work in progress?
Yeah, it's a huge archive, and as I mentioned in the presentation, it's currently waiting for conservation treatment. And so what I didn't highlight, sorry, when I mentioned that, was that it's very hard to sort of present the archive in an organised way until that conservation work has been done, because it's all, it's not just this to this, which requires treatment. It's kind of blocks of stuff, so which is going to end up in a sequential order. So it's going to take a little while, I'm afraid. And then somebody's bound to ask, how long? And that is very hard to answer, because we have to wait for the Tony Benn archive to have its mold treatment finished, and that's huge. We don't quite have an answer, unless you want to step in, Chris, and say something.
Yeah, no answer yet. I mean, we've always been told it should be soon, within a month or two. So we're not looking years. I mean, but hopefully, sort of into the new year, sometime the conservation side of things certainly be treated. I mean, the difficulty, I suppose, at the moment, until Andra started working on it, we were trying to provide access as much as we could when we could find things. But because Andra's working on it at the moment, it sort of makes it, in a way, a little bit more difficult to provide access to things, because it's in this sort of still this state of being sorted. But yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say we're talking months rather than years here. So into sort of the beginning of the new year, hopefully, that kinds of things. I mean, we are trying to keep, where possible, if there's any inquiries that come through about particular kinds of material, to keep an eye open. But again, that's becomes more and more difficult the more different things there are to keep an eye open for, as we go along. But certainly, if there are any things, then let Andrew or me know, and we can try our best to keep an eye open.
Right. Any other questions, please? Oh, no. Okay. Well, I mean, we can always pick up at the afterwards. If there are things that emerge. If are you staying with us, Andra?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that if you don't mind, we'll now move to Nick himself. I've known Nick for longer than I think either of us would care to think. But in fact, I think I first came across Nick at a conference that I organised in 2000. But Nick was already working on Max as part of his dissertation, but also as a general interest thing that he, in terms of British music in the 20th century and the 21st century. So it's been a collaboration between us, and as you can see, I mean, from what Andra said, we tend to have complementary ways of dealing with things. Like, I'm in the early diaries, he's in the late diaries. He looks at form, I look at technique, and so it's been a very, very flexible and interesting collaboration with Nick. And I'm always interested to know what he's dug up next, as indeed I think he is for what I've dug up. So without any further ado, Nick, please carry on.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to share my screen with you because I have got some slides. Right. I suppose I better ask. Just check with Richard. You can see those, yeah?
Yes, we can see.
Great. Okie doke. So my presentation is going to be slightly different to Andra's, and it's more kind of a formal paper. So it's going to be a shift in tone, but hope it's not too much of a shift. So as you can see there, the title of this is The Doctor of Myddfai, using the sketches and other primary source materials to unveil the creative process. So I've recently completed a substantial article on Max's The Doctor of Myddfai, and it examines the opera from principally two perspectives. The first addresses the work's dystopian setting and argues that key issues highlighted in the libretto, especially in relation to certain political concerns and environmental anxieties, have a strong contemporary resonance. And the second perspective focuses on the opera's articulation of Welsh identity, particularly through the use of Welsh folklore, native landscape and place, and indigenous musical signifiers. For the purposes of this talk, however, and hopefully leading on naturally from Andra's presentation, I want to demonstrate archival research in practice. So my attention is focused on several primary source materials associated with the opera and the extent to which these can help reveal the creative process and, by extension, enhance our understanding of the work. So the talk is in two parts. The first focuses on written and spoken texts, and the second on sketch materials. Composed in 1995, The Doctor of Myddfai, Max's third full-scale opera and his first collaboration with David Pountney, is a work that occupies an important position within the composer's output for the opera house and theatre. However, whereas a significant amount of scholarly attention has been afforded to Davies's music theatre works of the 1960s and the operas Taverner and Resurrection, The Doctor of Myddfai has been somewhat neglected by comparison. One of the main reasons for this neglect is perhaps connected to the widely held opinion that Max's works from the 1980s onwards, and this is a period in which he was composing, among many other works, of course, symphonies, concertos, and string quartets, are in some way more mainstream and conservative, and perhaps therefore less worthy of attention than the more radical works of his earlier period, a group of compositions which should also include Resurrection, which despite its completion date was started in 1963. However, I would argue that this viewpoint is unhelpfully reductive and unjustly dismissive of the later works, the majority of which are highly stimulating and powerful musical statements that invite close, detailed scrutiny. This is certainly the case with The Doctor of Myddfai, and two additional factors make this work significant in relation to the composer's overall dramatic output. Firstly, as I discuss in the article, many dramatic themes in the opera have their origins in his earlier music theatre works, operas and chamber operas. And secondly, given that the work completed a trinity of large-scale operas, it seems likely that it held a personal significance for the composer, especially if one takes into account the following comment from Max's private journal of 1974. He says, and I've got it on the screen for you there, "I remember in a moment of insight 10 or more years ago, seeing a lifetime's work of 3 operas, Taverner, Resurrection, and a third one, Seen, Heard from Afar, taking place in something akin to, if not actually in, an enclosed order, in a musical condition of ever expanding and intensifying contemplatio." Several primary sources are available to help sketch out an evolutionary timeline for the creation of the work. These include Davies's own private journals, an interview with Davies given prior to the first performance of the work, the memoirs of Judy Arnold, Davies's manager from 1975 to 2006, and an article by David Pountney concerning his role as librettist and producer. In her memoir, Arnold recounts that she first received a phone call about the project in May 1992 from Matthew Epstein, who at that time was General Director of the Welsh National Opera. With the calamitous 1987 Darmstadt production of his previous opera, Resurrection, still fresh in his mind, Max was at first reluctant about writing another opera. According to Arnold, and I quote, "Resurrection had proved to be a disaster. The director had taken no notice whatsoever of Max's own libretto and stage instructions, and what had emerged was an entirely different animal. Max was totally shattered by the experience." However, Max gradually warmed to the idea of composing a new opera after receiving assurances from Epstein that a suitable director would be involved with the project from the outset. Epstein came back with a name, David Pountney, a suggestion to which Max responded positively. Pountney's role as librettist, however, was not communicated to either Max nor Pountney at this early stage. This came later when Epstein met with them both to discuss the project at Judy Arnold's London flat. "I had no idea what I was in for," admitted Pountney, but as the conversation progressed, it became clear that Max was to write an opera for the WNO's 50th anniversary season, and it also became clear that I was to attempt to supply a libretto. The relationship between composer and librettist progressed cordially. Both individuals spent the next few weeks trawling through Welsh literature, including the Mabinogion. And even at this early stage, they had agreed, and I quote, "to write something modern, or at least with an immediate contemporary resonance." By the time they had met in London in November 1992, they had alighted on the subject. In his private journal for that month, Davies writes, "Good meeting at the Colosseum with David Pountney. He has turned up an adaptation of a Welsh folk tale, which looks very promising. Lots of chorus work, sexual transformation, and present-day mythic elements. Suggested that the chorus should sing its hymns in Welsh." In actual fact, the folk tale in question, based on a story connected with a lake in Carmarthenshire, Llyn Fan Fach, a story that does not appear in the Mabinogion, actually, was suggested to Pountney by a friend of his wife, Mary Utsel Edwards, a teacher based in the Swansea Valley who had dramatised the tale with several of her primary school classes. According to Arnold, the idea was that David and Max would collaborate all along with the writing of the libretto, but this did not happen. David wrote the libretto in its entirety, sending drafts to Max as he went along for approval, all of which were accepted without demur. Given the fact that the Doctor of Myddfai was the first dramatic work for which Davies did not write his own libretto, the situation may have given rise to artistic conflicts of interest, disagreement, and mistrust. But from Davies's perspective, it turned out to be a wholly constructive process. I respect David Pountney's work, and he has a far better knowledge of opera than I have. And I thought, come on, let's give it a go. As he presented ideas and drafts, as we discussed it, I was very optimistic and remember particularly going to see him in France for a weekend. I think that Act 1 was completed at that stage. It really had a good feel, and I could sense a natural growth through it and a dramatic shape, and I was very excited by it. For me, it's a great luxury to have someone else to do the words. Normally, I wouldn't trust them. The final draft of the libretto was completed relatively early on in the whole process, on the 2nd of November, 1993, in fact. And this libretto is in the British Library. The commission for the opera was also confirmed in that year, and the date for the premiere was set for June 1996. In the interim, Davies was engaged in a period of exhaustive professional activity. This involved the fulfillment of various commitments with the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra and the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, for both of which Max was appointed associate conductor and composer in 1992. In addition to the composition of the 8th and 9th Strathclyde concertos, the 5th Symphony, the Beltane Fire, and nearly 20 other works besides. The intensive nature associated with such a heavy workload clearly had an impact on the composition of the Doctor of Myddfai. In her memoir, Arnold relates that she had to attend a meeting with Anthony Freud, who had replaced Epstein at the WNO in 1994, to inform him that Davies was behind in his schedule for completing the opera, a situation that, according to Arnold, was very unusual. As it transpired, the date of the first performance of the work was pushed back by only 1 month. Perhaps I should also say at this point, which I forgot to inform you earlier on, if you are interested in reading Judy Arnold's memoirs, they are unpublished, but they are available at the Orkney Library, and you'll be able to view them online. According to his private journal, Davies started work on the opera in August 1995. Composition progressed slowly at first, but the pace increased during September. By mid-October, he was working quickly. On the 17th of October, he reported that Myddfai is going well, had lunch with David Pountney, very constructive. But on the 4th of November, he was somewhat less optimistic. In Myddfai, I'm doing my best, what I can and all that. It is such an unholy rush. If I don't produce around 10 pages of full score out of the corresponding number of pages of sketch each day, I feel guilty and depressed. And even this is too little, with an end of November deadline. He persevered, but missed the deadline, eventually completing the work at home in his Croft House, Bunatoon, on the island of Hoy, on the 12th of December, 1995. From Davies's point of view, the first performance of the Doctor of Myddfai represented something of a personal triumph. In his private journal for July 1996, the composer records that the new opera in Cardiff, very positive, had to make quite small adjustments, but in most places the score works. Paul Whelan as the Doctor of Myddfai, Gwyn Howell as the ruler, and Lisa Tyrrell as the child beyond reproach, and the work of Richard Armstrong and all the music staff helpful as I have never experienced before in the Opera House, and self-effacing with it. Excellent staging, David Pountney's direction of his own opera, and the sets, costumes and lighting, all marvellous. For me, the real heroes, the chorus, absolutely magnificent. And the orchestra were giving, forgiving and patient. This mostly RA's doing. Let us now move to the compositional process itself by considering the sketch materials available for the work. And these are housed at the British Library, as you can see on the slides. When I consulted these in 2019, I was immediately struck by the curious absence of pre-compositional materials, such as plain chant derivation, sets and charts. And this scenario was very unusual for such a large-scale work. Further investigation and a very welcome helping hand from Richard revealed that some of these pre-compositional materials were bundled together with other sketch materials for Naxos Quartet number 2, composed 8 years later in 2003. This material amounted to 14 pages in total, on which the first page, the composer, as you can see here, had scored out at the top the Doctor of Myddfai and replaced it using his own invented script with end sketches sets. And the translation, as you can see on there, is editorial and of course not in Max's own hand. This collection included the expected sets and charts, but the fact that it did not include any plain song workings, where typically Max would show how the main set is derived from the plain song, suggested that it was incomplete. Moreover, thematic features in the charts appeared to be familiar, raising the question as to whether these were originally for an earlier work. Close scrutiny of the 14-page collection supplied two further pieces of evidence. Firstly, it included transposition and magic squares for the Moon, Mercury, and Venus, as well as duration and pitch workings for the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, all of which were closely thematically related, suggesting that they originated from a single source. And secondly, on folio 85, Davies, as you can see here, writes Ec dies above a pair of Mercury squares. This is a clear reference to the plain song source. Both pieces of evidence pointed to the Fifth Symphony, composed in 1994. Not only is Ec dies used in this work, but a distinctive pre-compositional technique is used by the composer, whereby the plain song derived 8x8 Mercury squares are reduced down to 3x3 Saturn squares. Even Davies's missing plain song workings for Ec dies and Domine audive, and that's the other plain song used in the symphony, both of which Max sourced from the Liber Usualis, can be found among the sketch materials for the Fifth Symphony. Furthermore, the 9-note melodic phrase heard towards the end of the Fifth Symphony at figure V2 is also used at the start of the Beltane Fire, an orchestral poem composed in early 1995. And the same collection of notes, hopefully you can see that clearly on the screen there. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the printed, published version of Symphony Number 5, and that's the cello's line. So it's bass. You're reading that as bass clef, F, B, A, B flat, D, C sharp, E, A flat, G, or G sharp, G. That appears on the second page, folio 84, on the right-hand side of the screen there, of the 14-page set of pre-compositional materials. So this 9-note set on the right-hand side of the page is the first line of the left 9x9 square on folio 84. And here is the manuscript in question, folio 84. This is the original transposition square, or set square, as Max calls them. And the resulting magic square of the moon, or lunar, is on the right. So hopefully you can see that. We've got two squares here. On the left, you've got a 9 by 9, and that's the set square, the transposition square. And on the right-hand side, the magic square of the moon, that's another 9 by 9 square. In actual fact, all of the pre-compositional materials contained within the 14-page collection are used in both the Fifth Symphony and the Beltane Fire. But in spite of this, in the draft score for the opera, Davies appears to refer to the two squares on the screen in combination, side by side, as constituting the Doctor Lunar Square Complete. And I've got it here, again in his own alphabet script. Conclusive confirmation as to the origin of the pre-compositional materials used in the opera is provided by the composer's private journal for October 1995. He says, the material is that of Symphony No. 5 and the Beltane Fire, so at least I know it well enough to be confident. But this is not quite the end of the story. The Fifth Symphony also incorporates material from another orchestral piece of Davies's, Chat Moss. Composed in 1993, this work, itself based on the same two plain songs used in the symphony and the Beltane Fire, is part of a series of autobiographical works based on familiar childhood localities. With the inclusion of this orchestral piece, we can therefore link together a chain of works. Chat Moss, Symphony No. 5, the Beltane Fire, the Doctor of Myddfai, Naxos string quartets. They appear to be related by parent plain songs and shared pre-compositional materials. One can only speculate as to whether this lineage has a particular autobiographical connection, or is more prosaically a matter of convenience, namely a busy composer reusing particularly fertile material. In conclusion, then, this short paper has shown that manifold benefits can be gained from using primary source material when studying certain works, especially the large-scale compositions. Indeed, they serve as highly useful tools to help unveil the creative process, a process which might otherwise be cloaked in mystery and ambiguity. I'm going to come off my share now. There you go. Richard, I think you're muted. You've done exactly what you told me not to do.
Oh, damn. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nick. I mean, it's always fascinating to unpick where Max has his ideas, and we've noticed over years and years that a work is not an isolate. That there some works generate the material for others, which is quite logical, really, when you think about it. I mean, why would you spend all your time regenerating? I mean, people might not know that Max's earlier processes required him to write out complicated transformation sets every time he wanted to use a new transformation sets. So you've got a pile of papers that thick, say for Taverner 2. And Julian last session gave us an insight into Max suddenly realizing, I think, that magic squares were his way forward to actually make this material more compressible and more. And clearly, what you're demonstrating here is how Max then uses that to generate more than just one composition, another, making it a much more fertile way of and interesting, because in some cases, the use of chat moss, for example, suggests that you can perhaps anticipate there's some biographical elements or autobiographical elements in it as well. And we know that comes from some of the set names that he uses occasionally, representing an individual with whom he's associated at the time, said he subtly. Are there any questions for Nick?
Perhaps I could just quickly respond to that. I think what you said there is absolutely true about Max, and particularly in this case, because the Doctor of Myddfai is an opera about place. It's about a particular area in Wales, part of it anyway. And I think this idea of having material from Chat Moss, which also is autobiographical, but also a piece about place, it kind of fits in very nicely with that. And Max, of course, was a composer of place in many of his works, Rome, Orkney, Las Vegas, which I noticed Andra had that lovely medallion from Caesar's Palace there. So yes, it just makes sense, I think, for this, and it's a nice connection actually with that earlier piece, and of course, together with the Fifth Symphony and Beltane Fire, and looking forward then to the Naxos string quartets. I think, there definitely needs to be more work done on how Max reuses and uses connections to other pieces, and it's a fascinating area. It really is.
Yes. And any questions? Andra, thank you.
It's more of a comment, really. Just near the beginning, Nick, you spoke about, or there was an excerpt where Max described himself as guilty and depressed. And I just wanted to say that in a lot of the correspondence, particularly with his mother, he talks about the pressure of work a lot and about being exhausted a lot. So to be able to date, well, the ones from, even his letters don't have dates, but to be able to date those letters and his mother's responses where she voices her concern for him, we'd build up a better picture of what that was referring to and what sort of pressure he was under for the pieces he's working on, which would be interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He was a workaholic, wasn't he, Max? He'd put himself under tremendous pressure, and he'd, work his fingers to the bone, to be quite honest with you. And, he would enjoy moments. I think this is why he loved Rome so much. It's somewhere he could just escape to, and we know he went with friends on holiday to France as well, where he just escape everything, and he loved those moments. But inevitably, he knew he had to return and fulfill these very prestigious high, these commissions. So yes, that definitely comes through in the diaries, and obviously by the sounds of it, it comes through in the letters as well. So yeah.
I mean, one always assumes that a composer has sort of assurance of what they're doing, but in Max's letters, his diaries, his comments, it's quite clear that he was not at all sure of his place in history, his place as a composer. That he has a lot of self-doubt. Which is a fascinating, in itself is a fascinating psychological aspect of his work.
Well, you yourself, Richard, have published on this, haven't you? By saying that every 10 years or so he had this period of crisis, compositional crisis, where he would really doubt his own work, usually towards the end of each decade.
Yes, well, I mean that was based partly on 69 with The World's Bliss, and that terrible reception from the audience, and then 79, a letter to John Amos actually, which he says I'm having real difficulty. That was an early letter available in the British Library, in the John Amos collection, But as you can see quite clearly in '79, he looked as though he was motoring with The Lighthouse and with Cinderella, running off almost at the same time. So it's difficult to see what's, it's almost like he was doubting, but he worked through it. Yeah. But he would have little moments of crisis. It's hard to say, of course, now.
Yes, yeah. I think this is why the letters and the diaries are so important, though, aren't they? So we can verify that and see beneath the surface of these works, because on the whole, he was a prolific composer. We know that, and it looks as though composition came very easily to him. But it's never as straightforward as that.
No. Andra, just to say a word about you asked me if that was sensitive material. Well, the three words. The first word is ref, R-E-F. Mm-hmm. The second word, and I don't know why, but it's W-Y-R''S, wires. And then the last word is really difficult to work out because he's written over. It could be prouder, pruder. It's a whole load of things because the U has been written over the top of something else. So it's PR, and then two letters have seemed to be melded together, then D, and then R.
Oh, yeah.
So I can't really tell you what the last one. It doesn't look as though it's sensitive. No. But I have no idea who wire or what wire is. W-Y-R.
I think Aidan had your hand up, didn't you, Aidan?
Yeah. I suppose this is a general question about the research in context, because a lot of what has been coming up about him having this crisis every 10 years, almost accurately, of a lot of self-doubt, of even the use of code in different ways. And in looking at the later works and the works after the 1980s, which people often just put to one side and say, oh, it's just him being a bit more conservative, is there a question of going into and analysing these works and consolidating that with his past? Or is it a better question to look at why he's maybe being conservative of his own actual artistic process, of what is he trying to capture in his own artistic identity, of consolidate and trying to find his sense of identity when he is going through all of this crisis in his sort of career?
Wow, that's such a good question.
I know it's a bit of a horrible one, but I'm just...
Yeah. Where do we start? I suppose Richard referred to a crisis of identity in 1969 with World's Bliss. We know that he went to Orkney in July of 1970, and it engendered within him a kind of an escape from that madness of the works of the late 1960s. So I suppose we can trace some kind of reaction to that and stability, shall we say, from the 1970s onwards. And by the time he's writing those works you just alluded to there, the 1980s works, the symphonies and the concertos, he becomes more of a kind of on the outside an establishment composer, doesn't he? And he was knighted and CBE and all of those things, and later on Master of the Queen's Music. So yeah, that all of those kind of external factors kind of point towards Max being the establishment composer. Interestingly, and I was talking to Fenella about this the other day, wasn't I? He's getting older as well. He's becoming more mellow. And I suspect that some of his opinions, which were quite radical and entrenched earlier on in his life, he was softening. I think we've just got to see that. I mean, I'm experiencing that now, moving in, late 40s, early 50s, that kind of period. I mean, this, I suspect I'm thinking of two things here, is attitude towards religion. and there's also his attitude towards monarchy. You know, those inevitably changed as and when the context allowed it, and how you know, when time just, you know, passes us by. So yeah, it's a really interesting question, Hayden, and not an easy one to answer. But yeah, his identity is his compositional identity, or his identity as a composer, inevitably evolved as the different stages of his life. And this is why his life and his music are so intertwined, I think, in this autobiographical sense.
I can say a bit more about that as well. I mean, I think if you look at the anti-clerical stance that he took, that is, I think, composed out by Resurrection. Resurrection is the one which actually, because after that you don't get much of that. What you do get is, and comes in the children's works, particularly to begin with, a concern for the environment. And then, of course, the political things that dominate with the Iraq War and so on. So I think, in a way, his anger, if we could put it that way, his frustration or whatever it was, sort of moved to more concern about the environment. And that Karen Olsen didn't. She's explored some of that in her dissertation in America. One thing to answer your question, I think George Mackay Brown was a really important find for Max, because you know, in the early 70s he read the book on the ferry over. It's funny, you can never believe Max is exactly whether he's telling the truth or not, you know. He could always exaggerates a little bit, but the point is he very quickly encountered Mackay Brown's work. And that was really important for giving him a sense of actual balance in the Orkney landscape. It was such a difference. He talks about, by the way, 62 to 73. He often refers to those as the terrible years. And there's no diaries for them. He only says it was all in the music, which could be true. He could easily have destroyed the diaries, because in the early diaries, pages are torn out, scored out, and so on. He could easily have destroyed them. But the interesting thing is that the whole thing about the processes, you can't really write, you know, it took him so long to write World's Bliss. I mean, he started in Adelaide in 65, and it wasn't done till 69. It takes so long that the Magic Square processes allowed him to make these bigger works with a more extended thing. I think he probably got the commission. He started work on orchestral work, which he then stopped work on before the First Symphony. That would have been the First Symphony. I think it was later, the stuff then was used in Black Pentecost in 79. And he sort of started to develop the symphony. And I think that was him not saying I'm a member of the establishment. It was a natural process of being able to have a greater technical control over what he was trying to do. It was experiments, if you like. You know, in some respects, and of course the most obvious one is Ave Maristella, where you get the first indication that he's using magic squares, at least that we found. But he certainly was thinking about it by then, and nobody's analysed the First Symphony to see if he might have been doing it. We don't know. There may be other material. People had got presents of material from him. Frustratingly, sometimes it's lost. I mean, half of the Ave Maristella stuff is lost. It's only because I photographed it that we actually have that. But we don't know who else has got stuff from him that we haven't found yet. Andra, you might want to say something about things that suddenly turn up, but unexpectedly.
I think it's been good having the connection with performers in Orkney who have gifts of things. I mean, you know of lots of stuff, but having the personal connection and trying to persuade them to perhaps gift it to the library to add to the wealth of material is something I've been trying to do a little bit with some success. But yeah, there's definitely more out there.
Good to know, but frustrating at the same time.
Yes.
Are there any other questions before I pass back to Nick to tie up? No? Nick?
Okay, thank you everybody for attending today. It's been really fascinating, and it's the first time I've presented officially, so it was interesting from my perspective too. And just to remind you, obviously this is the last one of this year, but Friday Forum will continue next year, 2022. We haven't set any dates as yet, but it's probably going to start around about Easter time. That's when we usually do it. But I just want to remind you that we do have an in-person, believe it or not, in-person, I say it again, PMD study day. It's called Unmasking Max, and it's being held at Cardiff University on Saturday, the 4th of December. So I think I sent a message round to everybody last week or so, but I will send a reminder to everyone on the network, and hopefully lots of people will come. And I'm delighted to say also that Richard will be delivering the keynote for that in-person day. So we're really looking forward to that. And we've got a lunchtime concert, which we're going to have 7 world premieres of Max pieces. So, most of them will be coming from the 1940s/50s, but there are 2, one from the 1990s and one from the noughties as well. So I'm really, really excited about that. And they're all performed by students at Cardiff University. Okay, well, thank you ever so much once again. And we'll see you soon, hopefully in December, but if not, online next year. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.